Geoff McDonald, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm looking forward to your show.
Yeah, it's going to be great. So, well, let's get straight in. I mean, tell us what you do.
Leanne, look, I had a 25-year career with Unilever, culminating in a sort of global HR role. And during that career back in 2008, I got very ill myself with anxiety-fueled depression. But I made a decision on the day I was diagnosed not to be burdened by the stigma of my illness, and got all the love and the support to keep me alive.
Hmm.
And then in 2012, I lost a very good friend. And after losing him to suicide, I lay in bed that night and I just thought to myself, stigma has just killed my friend. And that's not fair, because had he been suffering from a physical illness, he would have put his hand up and got help. But because he was suffering from a mental illness, he couldn't. And I just felt that that wasn't fair. And that was the beginning of a real journey for me, where I began to advocate and campaign around breaking the stigma of depression and anxiety in the workplace. And then did a piece of work in Unilever while I was still working for Unilever in sort of 2013, leading some work around breaking stigma. Saw an amazing result as a result of that work, and decided to then, at the end of 2014, leave and go do what I'm doing now. And I suppose what I'm doing now are two things, as I'm trying to help organizations rediscover their purpose as an organization and contribution to society, but more importantly, helping them to really create an environment and a place where people feel that they can put their hands up and ask for help if they are suffering from depression or anxiety, just like people feel they have that choice if they had a physical illness.
Mm. Yep, completely agree. I mean, what would you say, if you had to take the barometer of the corporate culture at the moment, where do you think we are on mental well-being as a priority and reducing the stigma of it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And it's funny, just on LinkedIn today, I'm in a bit of a debate on that. I think, if we were to go back 4 or 5 years, I think the progress, or let's say the conversations that are taking place today, it's just amazing. The sorts of conversations that are beginning to take place, in the workplace. And when I talk about the workplace, I try and make sure that that's as broad a definition as possible. So the army, the NHS, financial services, law firms, commercial businesses, etc. So, prisons, the fire brigade. And so I think that, there's been some amazing work done in this country over the last couple of years of really raising the awareness around mental health. But I think that the stigma in the workplace is still very, very rife. I think we see lots of organizations trying to do some stuff, which might be they run a few mindfulness courses or they started to introduce yoga. But I think that people are still very afraid of talking about their mental ill health in the workplace. And so, kudos to the progress that we've begun to make, but let's not underestimate the significant challenge that we still have in normalizing mental ill health in the workplace.
Mm. Why do you think the stigma's there? Why do you think it's sticky? It's hard
Yeah,
to
look,
remove.
I think there are a couple of reasons. One is, I think it's about, just ignorance, a lack of education. When we went to school, we were taught physical education. Nobody ever taught us anything around mental education. I call it mental hygiene. So I was taught about physical education and PE classes, but nobody ever taught me what I might call mental hygiene. My mother taught me about dental hygiene, and guess what? My teeth have fallen out. But nobody ever spoke to me about mental hygiene or mental health.
Yeah.
And so I think that one is, I think there's still a significant level of ignorance around mental health. The second thing is, I think that the narrative that we have around mental health is still so negative. So I think I've said this to you before, Leanne. If you walked into a Nike store, plastered all over the walls in a Nike or Adidas store would be images of the most fit-looking, chiseled whippets, people whose bodies you'd love to have.
Mm.
Look at those pictures and you think to wow, I'm going to go and buy myself a pair of running shoes because that's what I want to try and become. When we look at the images around mental health, the images are so negative. There's nothing inspirational. There's nothing aspirational around looking after our mental health. And even when we use the word mental health, in fact, I've started to be very careful how I use it, because when you use the word mental health, people immediately go to the negative. They'll go to depression or anxiety and if I use the word physical health, you wouldn't immediately go to cancer or to glandular fever or to diabetes. And so I think that the narrative around mental health is still very, very negative. And I think the third thing, particularly in the workplace, is I just don't think that there are enough courageous leaders out there who are prepared to be vulnerable and to talk about their own vulnerabilities with respect to their mental health. And, in some instances, I mean, this doesn't mean that every senior leader or leader out there needs to have had a story or an own personal story about their own maybe struggles with mental ill health. But all of them have got a brother or a mother or a father or a friend or a sister or an uncle that has suffered. And, they could be telling those stories and the wonderful support that they gave to those people. And that then begins to normalize this. And people begin to say, oh, okay, so my leader actually understands this stuff. It might be okay for me to talk about. And so I just think there's a real absence of courageous leaders from the workplace. We've seen courageous sportsmen. We've seen courageous celebrities. We've seen courageous members of the royal family. But where are the courageous leaders from the workplace? And I think until they begin to lead some of these campaigns and help to raise the awareness and tell their stories, I think that the stigma in the workplace will remain high. So look, lack of education, a real negative narrative around mental health, and I think not enough leaders being courageous enough to share some of their vulnerabilities in this space.
Yep, I completely agree. I want to come back to the one about courageous leaders, but just thinking about what is mental hygiene to you? Just want to backtrack for a second and get a real definition of it.
Yeah, look, it's my own little term, and some people don't like it, but for me, it's about what are the things that we can be doing to keep our minds healthy or fit. So maybe if we moved away, even if I wanted to make the analogy or the metaphor to physical health, we talk about fitness. So what about our minds being fit, and what is it that we need to do to keep our minds fit and to keep our minds healthy? So, how do we begin to engage in learning to be more present in our lives? And if that requires us to learn how to be more mindful and to learn some mindfulness, then really important. How important it is for us to maybe consider things like meditation or yoga. But also, I think that, and so, and for years we've known about these practices, but they've kind of almost seemed to be Eastern practices or practices that people with sandals and open toes and beards do. And so I think that there's something around the education around some of these, what I would call practices that we should begin to employ, and that would suit us. And as we learn more and more to keep our minds healthy. And I don't think we can keep our minds healthy without also being physically healthy. So I think there's something about, also maintaining our physical health as well as our emotional health. And I distinguish between, emotional health of doing the things that make you really happy or content versus, mental health where we learn to focus and to keep our minds healthy. And so, I think it's a combination of factors. It's quite holistic, this whole thing. So there's, jumping on my bicycle this morning, for example, is part of maintaining my mental health. It's actually a time where I in a funny way, I'm with myself and I meditate. And so it's a physical activity, but it's contributing to my mental hygiene, So I think there's the physical, there's the emotional, there's the mental, and then there's also this whole concept of having a sense of purpose and meaning in our lives and wanting to give back to society. And I think a combination of those things all help to maintain your physical, emotional, mental, and your overall well-being by having this sense of purpose as well.
Yep. I mean, I categorise it into physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being,
Yeah,
and I
yeah. I
completely
mean,
agree about the holistic aspect.
yeah, I don't use the word spiritual in business or in with the workplace yet
Mm,
because they kind of they probably think that I'm a bit loony. So having the sense of purpose or meaning, which absolutely is around that kind of spiritual health. So what is our what is why was I born? Kind of answering that question. I think it was Mark Twain who said the two most important days in your life: the day you were born and the day you find out why you were born. That kind of sense of purpose, meaning, giving back to society. Yeah.
yeah, no, I love that. I read a statistic in the Mental Health Foundation website that 1 in 6 people will have a common mental disorder, which is usually typified around anxiety and depression. So it's very,
Yeah.
very prevalent. And you're
Yeah.
right.
On that, Leanne, I actually think it's 1 in 1. So,
Mm,
I think that we all have mental ill health during our lifetime. And, some of us just suffer a little bit more than others. We all have days when we're feeling very anxious. We all have days or weeks. Sometimes some of us have then weeks where we actually then get diagnosed with anxiety or depression. It might be months. But I think we all experience some form of mental ill health. It's just we live on this kind of spectrum, and so I think it's 1 in 1 rather than one in
mm,
six. And yes, maybe when you talk about chronic illness, it is something like that. But I think again, it's about trying to normalize this to say, we all. When I say to people they're mental, and they physical. When I say they're mental, I mean people kind of what are you saying? Yes, you are mental and you are physical, and how much more can we be doing to just normalize this term mental and give it a kind of more positive aspirational narrative rather than the dark negative narrative that it has today.
yeah, completely agree. Coming back to courageous leaders, I hope I'm not going to embarrass you by asking you to talk a bit about the event you ran last year, because I think it was kind of one of a kind flagship event, really.
Oh, thank you, Leanne. And yeah, it's amazing. I mean, we've just done another one of those events in Edinburgh. We're just planning one down in Guildford for the Borough Council. After our podcast, I'm talking to somebody to do one in Dublin.
Mm,
Really, what this was, it was very much inspired by a lady in the US who is a lady who she calls herself the bipolar mum, and she runs events in the US where people just tell their stories. So you go to a hall and there are people telling their stories of their struggles with depression or anxiety or bipolar. And I kind of thought to myself, coming back to the point around, not enough leaders from the workplace telling their stories. And so I asked 7 leaders from the workplace who I've got to know over the last couple of years, whether they would be courageous and whether they would be prepared to share some of their vulnerabilities, which they did. Fantastic that Deloitte gave us, an event, a venue.
mm,
And yeah, we had the most amazing evening with, first time ever here in the UK where some significant leaders from the workplace were sharing their stories. And, not all those stories were their own accounts, as I said earlier, of depression or anxiety. So for example, one of the leaders, spoke about what it was like to be the father of a son who suffers from depression. And it kind of just suddenly normalized this for everybody. And so, yeah, that was the one, that's one. And it looks like we're going to be running a few more of these, and I hope many more into the future.
mm. Oh, it was a very powerful event. To hear people of that level, that C-suite level. There was a
Yeah,
partner at Freehill, Herbert Smith, who Sam's actually
yeah,
coming on the show in a couple of weeks' time. Um,
fantastic.
and to people of that level of seniority, to start talking about this is
Yeah,
inevitably going to make it easier for all those junior associates and the people under Sam at Herbert Smith. It's going to be easier to talk about now because she's been courageous enough to say, actually, this is what happened to me. And then I
yeah,
came back and I thought I was better, and you know what, I wasn't. And I came back again and now I'm fine. But I've learned all this about myself and my environment. And to have people also, different levels, but senior levels, is inevitably going to help things. But it kind of leads me into another question, which is how much do you feel that it's the responsibility of the employer to lay out the foundations for good mental hygiene, and how much is it the responsibility of an individual?
So yeah, Leanne, I mean, there's some, I don't know if you've seen some of the latest statistics that's come from mine this week around the workplace and the impact that the workplace is actually having on people's mental health. And so, absolutely employers have got a huge responsibility to begin to create environments that are conducive to mental health, positive mental health. There was somebody, and I can't remember who quoted this, but I love the quote, which is, if the flower doesn't bloom, there's nothing wrong with the flower. It's the environment it lives in. And so on the one hand, organizations have got a real responsibility. And I think they should see this responsibility as a competitive advantage into the future, because for me, mental health, together with physical health, emotional health, and having purpose and meaning, if you attend to all of those aspects of yourself, you are an energized individual. Yeah. And energy for me is such an important driver of performance. But we've never ever included energy in our performance management or our development conversations with people. And I would argue that it is the most important driver of people's performance. And I think we should stop using the word resilience, and we should talk about how do we ensure that our people have the utmost of energy to be able to perform at their best. And they will if they've got energy. For years, we focused on skills and knowledge and behaviors and experience. But now is the time, I think, that we should be really focusing on energy. And we know what gives energy, and that is well-being, your physical, emotional, mental, and having a kind of sense of purpose in your life. And so I think, organizations should now begin to see this, because if they can create more energized employers, I think that gives them a competitive advantage. And so as organizations, I think they've got to address and provide support for all of those aspects of well-being. And for years they've done it on the physical side. So you go into companies and they've got gyms and they've got good nutrition in canteens, etc. But what are they doing to create happy workplaces? So addressing the culture. What are they doing to give people proactive practices whereby they can maintain their mental health? And has that organization got a sense of purpose and meaning? So yes, on the one hand, I think organizations have a real responsibility. However, I think individuals have as much responsibility. And this is why I want to begin to, move this conversation into the sort of performance area, because I think for years, companies have offered certain well-being initiatives, but guess what? Very few people take them up because nobody's held accountable for their energy. And so if we can find a way of also holding individuals accountable for their energy, just like we do with the skills they've got or the knowledge they've got or the behaviors that they are showing in the organization, and link it to performance. And so individuals are now being held accountable for managing and maintaining their energy. And I think we're getting to a time where we actually can measure those aspects of well-being, and you can you get a score around your energy, and how are you going to bring that score down over the next year becomes a discussion between the line manager and the employee. And so what you've now done is you've got an organization that has taken some responsibility for providing the right kind of support mechanisms for people to maintain their energy, and you are now saying to individuals, energy is critical to your performance, you need to be doing something about it, and I'm going to hold you accountable for that. And I think if we can get those two things right, then I think that we are going to see this whole concept of well-being, mental health, being seen as a competitive advantage and of a strategic importance to organizations. But until it's kind of still left on the side, and we have a well-being week, and during the well-being week we get some people to come in and do some talks, and then we forget about well-being until the following year when we've got another well-being week, it just has very little impact, and individuals don't feel that they are accountable, and nor does the organization.
Yeah. Ariana Huffington said, I think it was a year ago or so, she said, "This is a tough economy. Stress reduction and mindfulness don't just make us happier and healthier, they're a proven competitive advantage for any business. And she was talking specifically about well-being in the working world.
Yeah.
And I absolutely agree. I think you can already see a subtle move away from how much I'm going to get paid to how am I going to be treated? What's the culture like here? Is there that purpose? What is the well-being? And what I'm seeing in similar zones to you is that some companies are paying what I would consider to be lip service. So, but it's not really paying the right amount of attention, the right depth of attention to the issue. And undoubtedly, I think over time, any company that thinks lip service is enough or doesn't put the right amount of budget behind well-being is going to see themselves being, you know, less competitive. It's as simple as that, I think.
Yeah, I think there are two points you make there, Leanne. I mean, the first one is, you know, and it comes back to my point around, if you don't see well-being as the driver of the energy of your people, and energy is a driver of performance, and you then build it into the systems and the processes. So energy is, and you are overt about energy, and we are going to measure your energy, and we're going to help to provide support mechanisms to enhance your energy. And guess what? If you don't take those things, we're going to have some tougher conversations with you, just like we would if we didn't like your behaviors or you didn't have the skills or knowledge. So on the one hand, you know, organizations need to actually build this into some of their systems and processes around the performance and the development of their people under the guise of energy. And forget about this word resilience, because it just conjures up, I got to make you tough, and I'm trying to break the stigma. This is not about being tough or weak. This is about having energy and a capacity to get things done. But then your other point, I think, is so one, there's the performance angle, but then you're absolutely right. Then there's the angle around, you know, how attractive are you as an organization, and what's the quality of people that you're going to get to work for you, which determines the success of that organization into the future.
Yep. I know that countries like Sweden and Norway are doing this quite well, but is there anyone you can talk about here in the UK who's doing this really well, or at least broadly outlined in terms of industry sector or what they're doing?
When you say doing this well, what do you mean by this?
Well-being. I know Sweden's good with working hours. It's good with maternity leave, the ability to work flexibly. So I guess that's specifically what I mean.
You know, Leanne, if I were to say for me, the gold card around addressing well-being is in terms of what I have just spoken about, then I can't yet name one organization that has gone down this route of energy equals performance, which and therefore is part of our development conversations. We're going to measure you on it. We're going to hold you accountable. And by the way, we're going to have created a culture. Because remember, if we go down this route I'm suggesting, you know, when you get your energy score, it's going to either be high or low. And if it's low, that might be as a result of a mental illness that you are suffering. And we have to have broken the stigma, and there has to be a sense of trust so that I, as the subordinate, will be able to talk to my boss about that part of my score, which is bringing my energy down. And so, you know, I'm not yet aware of any organization that's got all of that right, where you've kind of got it in the system, where it's key to the performance of that organization, where they've addressed the stigma, where people feel that they can be really honest in their development conversations around their energy and around themselves as a human being. You know, we talk about human resources, a human resource function, who are responsible for creating development and performance management systems. Wow, imagine being able to have a really human conversation with your subordinates about their physical, emotional, mental, and purposeful state. So no, I just haven't come across anybody yet. I think there's some that are attempting to play with it, but there's nothing gold-plated yet.
No, I have to say I've not come across anyone who's adopting that approach and
you know, in this podcast, Leanne, I mean, I don't want to decry what some organizations are starting to do, because we know 4 or 5 years ago, I mean, there's no ways they would get somebody to come in and talk about sleep, for example. They might focus on nutrition and have a gym. or that there's no ways they'd get a mindfulness teacher to come in and do some mindfulness. And so, I think we're learning and we're making some progress, but I think we've got a long, long way to go still to really, I would love there to be out there some really courageous, leading edge HR professionals who want to take this on, this whole concept of well-being as being the driver of people's energy and therefore their performance and the overall attractiveness of that organization.
So if any HR professional is listening, what would you suggest that they could do straight away from hearing this?
Okay, well, I think the first thing that, a couple of things. One is, could they begin to think about how do they build energy into their whole development, performance management system? How do they begin to teach? Could they be teaching line managers how to go about having those sort of conversations around somebody's well-being at all levels? So doing a bit of training and education in that space. But as I said earlier, running parallel, I'll never talk about my mental health score if there's still a stigma, and I don't feel that there's a sense of real trust and openness in an organization. And so therefore, I would like to see more HR professionals then taking the lead in spending money, investing in educating all of their employees around what is depression, what is anxiety, what is stress, what are the symptoms to look out for, how do I support or have a conversation with somebody in my team, how do I bring somebody back into the workplace after they've been ill. So there's a whole piece of, Leanne, for years we've invested in health and safety. Guess what? It's all been in safety. It hasn't been in health. It's been in a bit of physical health. Now's the time to invest in the mental health piece. So breaking the stigma, education being the first thing. And then secondly is as HR professionals working with the comms function in their organizations to really shift the narrative in that organization around mental health and try and create a more positive narrative, an aspirational narrative, a narrative around how mental health is so important in the performance of our people. And that's why we want to put these support practices in place. So in summary, I think on the one hand is to have a real hard look at their performance management system and how do they build energy into that and teach line managers to be able to have real human conversations around the well-being of their people as part of that whole performance development of individuals. And then secondly, really invest in education and training around breaking the stigma linked to depression and anxiety and shifting the narrative, working with their comms function and really shifting the narrative to create something inspirational and aspirational within their organizations. Those are just some really simple ideas that I have.
Yeah, brilliant. We're out of time, unfortunately, but I'd love to do a part 2 on this, particularly drilling down into that energy piece, because that's obviously something that I'm very invested in and bought into as well. Geoff,
sure.
Thank you so much for your time. Let's do this again, and all the best.
Okay, cheers, Leanne. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, help us to reach more people by leaving a rating and a review on iTunes. We would really appreciate that, and it would help us to spread the good word even further. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you on the next show.